So, welcome everyone to another episode of Overlap. In this case, we are so pleased to be talking again to Tianchen from China Academy. Thank you, Tianchen, for joining us once again.
Thank you, Belen, for having me again.
You know that Overlap is a conversation from across the world, and if you were here or I was there, probably that would be right on topic, because today we're talking about migration, such an important topic nowadays that it's in the news outlets, it's in the political discourse, it's in discussion everywhere, probably not in the same ways. Maybe here in Latin America, over there in China, that is a little bit of what we're going to talk about. But it's definitely marking our time in terms of not only the opportunities that migration might open, but also the challenges and also the violence that is involved with such a topic right now, and particularly a complex one here on the other side of the world. So just to start off the conversation, Tianchen, what do you think about when you think about migration over there in China? What comes up?
Sure. So this is actually a very interesting question in China. Before we move to the broader topic of migration, I think I can just give a very basic background information of immigration in China, because yes, because when we're talking about immigration, China is entirely different from many other countries. China has long been a non-immigration country for centuries, but the idea of immigration sometimes went viral on the internet, but actually people don't even agree on what the immigration really means. For example, if we are in a typical immigration country and what we call immigration, we have a clear definition of immigration, which means a person who comes to a foreign country to live permanently, right? But in China, everything is different. If, for example, I used to live in the States for study and work in the States for almost 10 years, I would never call myself a Chinese immigrant in the United States because I only hold temporary study and work visa. I didn't intend to live there for most of my life. But in many Chinese people's mind, they may call someone in my situation as an immigrant. So when people debating about immigrants in China online, it's essentially like people are talking at cross purposes, leading to a very chaotic and unproductive discussion. So that brings us to the recent uproar about online about the K visa thing. Have you heard about it, Belen?
We have heard a little bit about that new K visa. Can you tell me a little bit more? What's it about? What's its objective? I know that it's been a hot topic.
Of course. So recently, it is reported that the Chinese government had opened up a new visa type called K visa. So K visa is supposed to issue to foreigners with a bachelor degree and above, specifically in STEM fields. So this really triggered a backlash online among Chinese people because with many people are fearing that China was about to face the same so-called immigration crisis as we've seen in many Western countries. However, by now, very little information is known about the K visa thing. The Chinese government hasn't disclosed how many visas they are going to issue and how the detail is going to be implemented. So, but one thing is for sure, that the K visa is not a work visa. So the K visa holders are not authorized to work legally in China. So from what I understand, so the K visa mostly apply to business trips, maybe short-term visits, exchanges, more like that. So not working, not like looking for a job really in China. So given how cautious and strict that the Chinese immigration policy had been, I don't think they are gonna to like open up to immigrants like suddenly on a large scale. So I think the online panic over the K visa thing is a bit exaggerated, but it does have like many underlying causes. And one critical broader social context is because China's economic growth rate is slowing and the labor market is becoming more and more competitive. And so people are feeling the pressure. So the K visa thing came out and it serves as a symbolic outlet for people's kind of like negative anxiety about jobs. That's actually what things happen. So this is indeed an important issue China needs to address at this time. But essentially, it has little to do with immigration, with the K visa thing. So in the foreseeable future, I don't think China is going to be an immigration nation. It's not going to be open up to large-scale immigration. So it's already very difficult for foreigners to find a job in China, not to mention to obtain the permanent residency or citizenship. Actually, I think China becoming an immigration nation is even less likely than human colonizing Mars. But if we're talking about like a small scale migration, it always exists in China, but it doesn't have a significant impact on most people, simply because like China is too large with 1.4 billion of population. So even a group of like 100,000 people is only a drop in the ocean. For example, we have a small city on the border in Yunnan province called Ruili. So in Ruili's busy days, they have like 100,000 people like coming in and out to the country on the border, but most Chinese people don't know that, and it doesn't have any impact on most Chinese life. And there's a lot of like people, like Burmese people, Indian people, they already settled in Ruili, they already settled in China, but it doesn't affect anyone. So in fact, most Chinese people in their whole life, they don't get the chance to truly know one single foreigner. I mean, they may meet someone like on the street, but they don't know them like in their life, in their work, at schools. Like all the classmates, like schoolmates, colleagues, relatives, all of them are Chinese, and so they don't need to meet some foreigners. So it's not like American people. They may go to a Chinese restaurant, they may hire a Mexican gardener, and they may go to Vietnam nail salon. That's part of American life, but in Chinese life, it's all Chinese. So I think that makes the whole idea of immigration or migration totally different in China compared to most countries in the world. But if we talk about like small scale migration, China does has a trend of a kind of like an outflow of population, and these Chinese people do settle some overseas communities. And as China's progress of opening up, we do see more and more interactions and exchanges between foreigners and the Chinese. And I think it's going to be increasingly frequent and closer in the future. So we can touch on this later. So hope this. Yeah, I hope this gives you an overview of how the migration or immigration in China. And I believe it's totally a different picture in Latin America, right?
Definitely. And everything that you were saying was so not surprising, but yes, just so different in terms of how just a different in the way in which where we stand and the reality of our nations historically, and also in terms of the present, what the country needs, how the job market is. It really affects like day-to-day life, what you were saying about people maybe not meeting a foreigner. And you're right, for nations that for different reasons, they have been exposed to a lot of migration and intercultural exchange, that idea of not meeting someone from a different culture, maybe not its life, it's really just so different. Also, maybe what I'm speaking of is more common in major cities, and also a take on like a cosmopolitan way of thinking about a city. You were talking about maybe a US experience of many cultures combining in one single city, and the Chinese restaurant, the Vietnamese salon. But if I think of a Latin American experience from like a rural town somewhere up in the mountains, that idea, that relationship with the outside world would be much closer to what you were describing. So it's interesting also to think how maybe inside each nation you would have different perceptions of migration as well. I was just thinking, Tianchen, from what you were saying before we go to, and I was thinking a lot about a lot of things about Latin America in what you were saying, but you were describing this situation with the K visas and the like online panic it had unleashed, and what people were thinking or commenting. And just to like have a better understanding of where that came from, what do you think that was making people feel? Like, was it from a job market perspective of like the fear of finding it difficult or more difficult to be in a more competitive market with people coming from the outside? Or do you think that it has like a cultural component of like being exposed to other cultures, people coming with other habits and other ways of life, being that China has like its very distinct way of doing things and preserving that culture?
I think mostly is economic foundation reasons. The cultural reasons is there, but I don't think it's a major thing. It's just minor, and I think the Chinese people's kind of like concern or fear towards the other cultures is just because what I said, because most people, they don't really get to know some foreigners, because they don't know that. So they have like different, various, sometimes wild imagination about the foreigners. Like they may think that these are totally like different people than Chinese. So the main reason is like they don't really get to know someone. They just meet them. So they don't see them as friends or colleagues or someone, has a tie with them. So I think once more and more people, more and more Chinese people get to know someone, get to know some foreigners in person, face to face, and talk to them, and they will get to know like we are all the same people. Like most people are the same people, and that's going to alleviate their any of their concern, or any of their fear right now. But I think for most part, for the economic reason, that's the real thing. That's the real issue. The Chinese government needs to address right now, but that's actually is nothing to do with the immigration thing.
Of course, and I assume that like that job market perspective is something that it's very talked on. Then you need to contrast that with the numbers, and like at least from a discourse that is very common in the US nowadays, and that has fueled most of the backlash against migration. Like it's a common discourse in particularly in crisis times, this idea of like blaming the immigrants, blaming the outside force for an internal problem. And then in general, and then you have to go case by case, but the numbers do not align with that discourse. But the discourse, it still is very close to what people resonate with. So one thing is what people, of course, like instinctually fear, maybe because they hear it, they repeat it, and then not that doesn't always translate to what actually happens, like in terms of the job market. But it's super interesting to see how different nations are going through that at the end of the day, it's one of the things that today's globalization is imposing, this idea that, well, every day, like, companies become more and more transnational and multinational, and capitals are going from one place to the other. And in the end, that ends up shifting the way that workers also go from one place to the other, looking for that globalized job market. So you were asking about Latin America, and I was thinking just how it's almost impossible to think Latin America without thinking about migration from like the very beginning of at least what we conceive Latin America and our region to be nowadays. Like the resulting nations and peoples that compose Latin America and the Caribbean right now, first of all, are basically the result of, well, that first movement, that first migration process that was the very violent conquest of our territories, right? By people coming particularly from the European continent, and what that happened and how that just met with, well, the native peoples from our lands in a very, very violent process and a very violent way, ending up in genocide of much of the natives people from our continent, of course, with different extents depending on the different regions. But from the very beginning, of course, that was not the beginning of just what was happening here in the Americas, because we have all that tradition from before that time, but that was just such a significant moment in which the shifts and migration flows have already been from that moment, marking the identity of what Latin American is today. So from that moment, then if you add just the forced migration and forced translation of people that was marked by slavery, and all those like people who were forced to come also to these territories, mainly from the African continent, in such a terrible and violent way, but that ended up shaping as well the identities and the cultures that today make up most of the continent. The Caribbean, for example, Brazil, have such important traditions in those African roots. So from that moment onwards, and without even counting all the shifts in migrations before that, the continent as a whole and the state nations that, compared to China, national states in Latin America are so young in terms of the years that they have been constituted at the nations that we call today, right? Many of them are hitting their 200 years old and have hit the bicentenary in the past decade. So during this past centuries, these nations have continued to be forged by other waves of migrations, also coming from within the continent or from Europe as well. And during the 20th century, for example. So again, it's so many peoples that have been just constituted by different forms of migration, in many cases in such a violent way. It's not the meeting of different cultures in collaboration that one Hispanic, very old tradition tried to impose this idea that our different cultures met and Latin America was born and we took the best of everything. There was violence, there was slavery, there was a genocide, and there's the people that we are in Latin America today are a result of all of that at the moment. And adding to that, if we think about migration in Latin America right now, like in the past decades, or since like the past decades that have established globalization and just neoliberal models in most of the world, you have to add the forced migration to which Latin America, as part of the global South, has been subjected to because of the unequal share of the global economy and the global market, and the way in which Latin America has been subordinate in that way to like the centers of the world and the centers of the labor force being in places like the US, like Europe, and well, other emerging markets nowadays. So that unequal share of the different just basic world economies have pushed harsher and harsher living conditions in many places of the global South, Latin America included, that forced people to move towards the places that were concentrating the job, like the job availabilities. First, in an instance, this is not linear, of course, right? But first, in an instance of moving towards the cities, that continues to happen. And then in an instance of moving just outside the countries, and many times outside the region as well, many times seeking those centers. Like that's why you have like a whole migration flow that at least until very recently was seeking the United States as the possibility of finding a job market that was drained, and geopolitically so, from our nations. And maybe a similar thing you can find with the migration flows from Africa to Europe, for example. And the problem is, and maybe what is so perverse at this time, is that maybe migration is the most structural consequence of the world that we live in nowadays. But at a moment in crisis, those same countries that impose that capital flow, that shape those structural movements, end up going back to some nationalist perspective, and then they're enforcing like closed borders policies and criminalization on migration, and end up hitting on like the weakest link of that is the individual migrant that was in many cases forced to look for a better job opportunity. So it's like a structural world problem or consequence of globalization in many cases, that end up criminalizing an individual as if it were a mere individual decision. That is something that is going through the continent. I don't think that it explains everything related to migration, of course, in the region. Maybe nothing does. But I think that you cannot think present migration in Latin America without thinking about those patterns, and without thinking about the necessary, like the causes, the root causes of those patterns. And also, and maybe we need to add this as an extra element, the power centers of the world have also realized that migration can be used as a political tool or a political weapon in terms of pressuring, as a war act can put pressure on a foreign enemy. Migration can also be used to pressure a foreign state. How? Well, if you make living conditions so hard and the possibility of attracting the labor market so attractive that you drain the human resources from a nation, that puts pressure on that state that is basically losing its resources. It's not the natural resources, but it's still the resources that states put a lot of effort into shaping, like their educated workforce, of course. And maybe Cuba, and the case of Cuba with the United States, it's one of the most clear examples of how the United States is very it's very much aware that this can be used as a weapon, with all the rules put in place regarding not only the very cruel blockade to ruin the living conditions in the island, but also all the benefits that they're giving, on the other hand, to Cubans that reached the United States, and that sustained over time, was very clear and in a very aware way, a way of putting pressure on a government that is sustained until today. So when at the end of the day, the United States is looking at migration and putting the blame always on the other side of the table, and talking now about, like, these are all criminals that are trying to come into my country, and like, you are responsible for this. It's like, you were the same person who was very much aware that this is also a political tactic used to pressure other governments. So definitely there's not an innocent movement over there. So a lot of it's at stake. Of course, it's not the only way to look at migration, but a lot of things are at stake and at the same time. And everything is at play while at the same time, Latin American states are trying to navigate this new world, and trying to create new job markets and new conditions in order to capture their own possibilities of living and their own new generation. So everything is happening at the same time. In this context, Tianchen, I wanted to ask you, like, anything of this, you were talking before about the like panic or just fear of losing job stability at hands of foreigners. Like, do these risks in terms of losing skilled labor, for example, is this affecting China as well? Is this something that you're talking also over there? Because I assume like China is a very up and coming and growing market. At least that's the way that the world is perceiving it nowadays. So maybe not in the same way than Latin America, but I don't know if something of this sort is happening over there.
Actually, it's also true in China, especially maybe like a decade ago. So I totally agree what you just analysis about the globalization, and that is what we have seen migration in the past few decades. And unfortunately, China is also part of the globalization process. China once experienced an outflow of top talent to the United States. For example, when I decided to study in the United States more than a decade ago, it was a very popular choice. Many best performing students in China, they want to study further in the States, especially in these more developed coastal region. That was even more popular. And we have like top 2 universities in China. Once the most prestigious path for these graduates is going to the United States to pursue a PhD. So people were joking that China is actually training the best talent for the United States. However, I think around 7 or 8 years ago, the trend kind of began to reverse gradually. Since that time, more and more Chinese students, they are more willing to stay in China for further studies. And even the best graduates from the top universities, they prefer to stay in China to pursue their PhD instead of going to the US. And even for those who still go to the US, they prefer to, more and more people prefer to to coming back to the China after they graduate, rather than staying in the States and to work for a longer time. So on the one hand, this reflects China's rising power and people's growing confidence, especially among the younger generation. So more and more young people now believe they and the country will have better prospects for development in the future in China. And only on the other hand, it's because the economic situation in United States is gradually worsened as well. So their job market is becoming more and more competitive, and it's even tough for the native-born Americans to find a decent, stable job now. Many Americans, they juggle multiple job positions to survive. So for foreigners, the situation can only be even tougher. At the same time, the U.S. government are becoming more and more hostile, strict on the immigrants or even like migrant workers. We have heard that many Chinese scientists and scholars in the States have been targeted by the U.S. government. They have been investigated, alienated, and even like public humiliated. And they are accused of being Chinese spies in the U.S. and their research fundings had been cut off. Some of them even lost their lives. So even from the very pragmatic perspective, it's no longer a wise choice for most Chinese to stay in the US and to spend most of their life there. It's not even safe. So for the US perspective, I think their policy is kind of short-sighted and stupid. The US is not like China. It's an immigration country since the first day of its foundation. So it's actually a nation built on the immigrants. The immigrants is actually their cornerstone. So for many years, like in US PhD programs, most of the candidates, they come from an immigrant's background. So that's how the US, like kind of what you just mentioned, they drain the talent from all around the world and make them to actually like contribute to the nation. And beyond these skilled labor, Americans' expectation of the ordinary migrant workers is also stupid. These workers, they accept much lower wage than the locals, and they bear very harsh working conditions, and they provide goods and services to the Americans. They're actually benefiting the American society. Americans enjoy the fruits of these migrant workers, and now they even try to kick them away. So, but I think for the rest of the world, it's actually a big good news. Is finally other countries don't stop sending their best talent and their best labor, their best human resources to the United States. So people finally realize that we may have some other choice other than the States. So that's a positive sign I'm seeing here. But yeah, indeed, that the immigration crisis is actually not for these global North countries. It's actually for these global South countries, what we have seen in Latin America and also like kind of in China. But because China has a huge population, so that doesn't has a real impact. But still, that's what we observe from the Chinese perspective.
And I was thinking, like, as you were mentioning, the United States shares with the rest of the Americas or Latin America that idea of like being born, or at least because being born or beginning sounds like whatever was before didn't last or is not a constituent of what is today, but definitely states that were constituted on that permanent migration and that permanent confluence, very violent, of different forms and different flows. And what you were saying was completely true. They grew on that workforce and they grew on that migration, and then they're also being the ones to reject it. I also think that there is a maybe future prospect in which, as I was saying before, they have used this possibility of attracting skilled labor in order to pressure other governments. So the idea that that stops might open other path for those laborers, both to stay in their homelands, to find other forms of cooperation or other forms of integration with other nations that is not as extractive of the workforce. However, also, we always need to keep in mind that with this migration policies and the way that the flows happen, I think it's always very like marginalized in terms of, or like segmented in terms of, like one thing is for the very skilled labor, the PhDs, the very high skill technical teams, and another thing is what happens to the labor force that is in charge of other activities, that is less skilled in terms of education, maybe, so less appraised in terms of like what they are worth to the job market, but so necessary for the building of our countries and our economies. And that segment is the segment that is the hardest hit when you look at migration going from Latin America to the US, but you could also think it to other countries, like to Europe as well, from migrations from other countries to Europe. Those lowest skill, I always hate that term, but workers are the hardest hit in terms of the worsening conditions in their homelands. They're mostly migrating because they cannot find a dignified living condition sometimes because of a globalized world market that is imposing that on those territories. And then at the same time, they are the first to be incarcerated, the first to be persecuted, the first to be left to die at a frontier. We're talking about so many dead in the Mediterranean Sea right now, like right this second. That also speaks of that workforce. So definitely, I wanted to make that distinction that I think it's always like good to keep in mind. But you were talking, like you were making some great points in terms of what differences can be open or what other possibilities can be thought of in terms of the movement of flows. I was thinking about one of the things you said at the very beginning, right? What do we consider migration? Like, are we talking about like moving permanently to somewhere else? Are we counting the possibility of spending a period of time working? Are we counting spending a period of time studying? Can we think of migration as a way of not living one's homeland forever to be the workforce of another country forever, but maybe like doing an exchange of going and learning some skills, exchanging knowledge, and then something that will eventually maybe come back to the country of origin and bring back some of that value? Like, I think that maybe, of course, again, the first situation, what we were describing before, is what characterizes the movements today. But I think that shifting that perspective opens up like other forms of migration that could unleash forms of cooperation that are not necessarily like extracting the workforce from one place to like adding value to another country, but have more to do with the exchange, have more to do with the solidarity. And there are experiences in Latin America, all over the world. There are experiences of states fostering this exchange, and they are fostering this exchange because they know that it can add to like their market value, like their job markets can be wider and more open, so they can have more possibilities, so they can attract more value, so they can like boost their economies by doing this cooperation and exchange, right? Like the European zone is very famous for its integration policies in that sense, and they are thinking about that in a mutually beneficial, like for them, right? Very restrictive for the outside, but for them, they thought about it in those terms. The possibility of everyone being able to move around and go from one place to the other and become like a unified job market in a sense. And Latin America has similar experiences and actually not as integrated, not as well developed. And the possibility of developing that also has to do with it being a global south and how the impositions of the global north tries to counter those effects. Like integration, regional integration from Latin America is sometimes so difficult because the globalized market and the north is imposing on these countries the idea that they have to compete, for like one segment of that market. But the possibility of integration, many think that is in their best interest. The possibility that, for example, there is an experience in the southern countries, Mercosur, with many countries being able, at this moment, they have the possibility of just moving among them without passport, just with their ID. And there's a lot of integration in terms of the job market. In that case, it's not exactly the same, not completely integrated, but there is a flexibilization in terms of movement, at least from one country to the other. There's an experience in the Eastern Caribbean as well that thought to foster free movement among the islands in the Eastern Caribbean to do the same thing. Like they were seeing, well, a lot of people is leaving our countries because they cannot find like possibilities of a good job, for example. And also we are countries very hard hit by natural phenomena as well. And that becomes a very unstable situation. What if we join together and we all become like one single area in which one of our citizens can look for a job, living possibility, then that becomes much more attractive and maybe will retain some of those citizens instead of just like losing them to the like big global powers, right? So these experiences are interesting to think. Of course, they are not set in a vacuum. Of course, we can never just put aside the fact that the global south at this moment is not setting the major workflows because they are always in subordination to the great transnational capital that is using a lot of global south resources, but is not set in the global south and not making decisions from the global south. But there are experiments and there are very interesting experiences in that way. And I was also thinking about Cuba, for example, understood very well, I think, and it's something that we need to keep in mind, how the exchange of people going back and forth in training, for example, medical teams that moved to other countries, not only to share their experience, but also to train new doctors, to tackle new diseases, and stayed over for periods of time in order to collaborate with them, and then came back. Also, educational experiences as well in terms of forming and educating teams that could tackle literacy issues in other countries. So you have experiences of workers moving from one country to the other. Yes, again, it's not the typical an individual moves forever to another country form of migration, but it is a way of exchange of the labor force that is thought in a completely different perspective and what were they doing aside from expanding the technical capabilities of the region? They were building ties of solidarity. They were building regional identity. And today, it's super interesting to understand, because I never experienced something quite like that among countries, that if you go to other islands in the Caribbean, people will talk about their Cuban doctors as if they were their next door neighbors. And it's something that speaks to other forms of integration that could be the key to shifting the way we look at migration at this moment. I don't know if anything like this resonates over there.
Yeah, exactly. If we stay with the neoliberal world order, if we stay with the neoliberal globalization, it will be always about the exploitation. It's always about extraction of the global South countries. And that's what we think and what we just discussed about. I think it's actually historical opportunity for the global South countries, since the United States and other Western countries, they are trying to drive the immigrants away. It's a time for more and more people, even more and more people are choosing to leave the global South country voluntarily. One of their main destination is the vast and diverse global South. So I think what you just mentioned, the new possibility of migration is actually the direction that China is moving towards. Although, as I mentioned earlier, that China is not going to be immigrant country in the near future, but the interaction and the exchange between China and the outside world is going to be, especially those in the global South, will grow closer for sure. At the national level, we have seen the President Xi Jinping has proposed 4 global initiatives, including the global civilization initiative, global security initiative, global governance initiative, and global development initiatives. All these 4 initiatives is going to be an add-up to the Belt and Road initiative. So it's all about how we can help the global South countries to develop their own path of their own path. So if we try to improve the local living of standards, that's actually gonna to really solve the problem that people can. It's because people cannot find enough job and opportunities in their homeland. That's why they are moving to the other more development regions or countries. And at the local level, I know the Chinese local governments, they have a bunch of projects across China are carrying out foreign engagement projects. For example, when there is one project called China Aid, it's inviting all kinds of foreigners coming to visit China and study Chinese model, and it involves almost every field you can imagine, from high technology to renewable energy to rural development, and to local governance, and to even traditional Chinese medicine, you name it, we have it. So that's all the results from the projects has been very encouraging. Meanwhile, more and more Chinese people are going to global South, moving to places like Southeast Asia and Africa, maybe less in Latin America, but I think simply because it's too far away from us. I even have some friends, they went to Africa to grow corn and wheat there. So I think for Latin America, we will see more and more Chinese settlers or visitors there. It's just only a matter of time. So I think the global South have two paths to jump out of the old world order. The first one is how we can explore, how we can develop our own local area, our own local economy. And the second is because the interaction and all this cooperation gonna to increasingly improve. It's gonna to create more and more job and opportunity within the Global South region. For example, just like the Cuba's medical team you just mentioned, I think we have the same Chinese team going abroad as well, and we have foreign medical team come to China to study, and they communicate and interact to learn each other's experiences. And if we can, for example, gradually build up traditional Chinese medicine across the world, and it's going to create more jobs than what we have now. So that's where I see where the future is and where the prospect is. And I totally agree that the Global South can see the migration in a totally different way, in a brand new way.
Definitely be working towards those possibilities. We really need to. Like, the world as it is pressing on these issues, and it's truly a matter of life or death right now. So definitely we'll need to find alternatives, or else, like, there's no other way. And definitely, I think in what you were saying, there's so many possibilities. Of course, I was thinking, as we develop this definitely new centers across the world that are not so like strict in terms of just the whole world market depending off a couple of centers that dictate everything. Of course, something like that needs to emerge in order for the Global South to be prosperous and be able to develop in their own countries. And hopefully integration and cooperation among the nations will be able to open those migration flows that are more of cooperation and solidarity. And in the meantime, of course, we'll continue to have to pay close attention to, well, all the casualties that are lying in the middle of this process, that are being those more subjected to being persecuted, and the violence and all this like escalation against the so-called quote unquote like immigrant criminals, thinking migration as something that could be criminal is very, very difficult in this context and in this world. So definitely we'll need to keep like an eye and just all our efforts on those casualties and those victims while we search for the emerging future that can hopefully find a place for us all in cooperation.
Definitely. Yeah. And I think people will start to appreciate more of the value of people-to-people interaction. It's not only among the experts, among the skilled workers, it's also among like ordinary peoples from all walks of life, for all the people like us. And so I really wish maybe someday I get a chance to meet you, Belen, face to face.
Well, definitely that will be our final project exchange of overlap when we do the definite migration. Thank you so much, Tianchen, for one more great conversation here.
Thank you, Belen.
It's been a pleasure, and we'll meet everyone on our next episode of Overlap.